I thought I was choosing my future. I was really losing my fate. The first time I saw him again, he was standing beneath the warm lights of the hotel ballroom like he had never left my life at all, calm, polished, and impossible to ignore. Everything about the evening had been carefully arranged to look effortless, from the crystal glasses to the soft music drifting through the room. But my hands still felt cold around the stem of my glass. I told myself I was here for business, nothing more. Just one meeting. Just one chance to close a deal that could change everything for me and the twins. But the moment his voice reached me from across the room, my body reacted before my mind could catch up. My heartbeat stumbled. My shoulders tightened. I had spent years learning how to look steady, how to smile when I wanted to disappear, how to keep my life neatly divided into the person everyone saw and the truth I guarded with everything I had. It had worked, too. For a while, at least. The twins were safe, my routine was stable, and I had built a small, quiet world where no one asked dangerous questions. No one knew how much I had sacrificed to keep it that way. No one knew what it had cost me to leave. And no one, especially him, was supposed to find me here. Yet there he was, speaking to someone beside him with that same composed expression I remembered so well, the one that always made him seem untouchable. He looked older now, sharper somehow, but still familiar in all the ways I had tried not to remember. The line of his jaw, the steady way he held himself, the kind of presence that seemed to pull the air toward him without asking permission. I could feel the room around me continue moving, people laughing softly, glasses clinking, shoes brushing over polished floors, but all of it became distant, as if I had stepped behind glass and he was on the other side of it. I should have turned away. I knew that. I told myself to turn away. But my feet stayed rooted to the floor, and then his gaze lifted, crossed the room, and landed on me with the kind of precision that made my stomach tighten. For a second, he looked uncertain. Just a flicker. Just enough to make my pulse jump in a way I hated because I had learned to live without expecting anything from him. Years ago, I had trusted a future that vanished faster than I could understand it. I had believed promises that sounded real in the moment and shattered the moment they were tested. I had walked away with more than a broken heart. I had walked away with secrets I could never afford to share. And now, standing in this room with expensive flowers on every table and a sea of strangers pretending not to stare, I felt the past rising around me like a tide I had no strength to stop. He started toward me, slow and deliberate, as if he sensed the pull too. My mouth went dry. My fingers tightened around the glass until I was aware of every tiny tremor in my hand. I had imagined this kind of moment before, late at night when sleep would not come, when I would lie awake and wonder whether he ever thought of me at all. In those imagined versions, I was braver, colder, ready. But reality did not make me brave. It made me careful. It made me afraid. Because some truths, once spoken, can split a life clean in two. And I had already built mine around the pieces he never knew existed. I was still holding the glass when he stopped 3 feet away, close enough for me to feel the shift in the room around us. Conversations seemed to dim. The clink of silverware softened. Even the music from the far end of the hall felt distant, as though the entire evening had tilted toward this one impossible moment. He looked older than I remembered, more polished somehow, but the same careful expression was there, the one that had once made me believe he saw more than he said. His gaze moved over my face, paused, and then dropped briefly to the glass in my hand. For a second, I thought he might ask why I was trembling, but instead he gave a small, measured nod, the kind a stranger might give at a formal gathering. It should have been a relief. It was not. "You came," he said quietly, his voice smooth and steady, carrying just enough warmth to make my chest tighten. I forced myself to breathe. "I was invited," I replied, keeping my tone even. It was not a lie exactly. It was simply not the whole truth. His mouth shifted, almost into a smile, though it did not quite reach his eyes. Of course. There was a pause then, one that stretched until I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. He glanced toward the table beside us, where a cluster of white roses leaned toward the candlelight, and then back to me. "You look different," he said. I almost laughed, but nothing in me felt amused. Different. If only he knew how many meanings that word carried. If only he knew how many nights I had spent becoming someone he could never have imagined. "People change," I said. My voice sounded calm. My stomach did not feel calm at all. He studied me in that quiet, unsettling way of his, as if he were trying to place a detail that had slipped just out of reach. I could tell he sensed something familiar, something unfinished. The silence between us was not empty. It was crowded with all the things I had never said and all the things he had never asked. Behind him, a waiter moved past with a tray of glasses, and a woman in a pale blue dress laughed too loudly near the entrance. But none of it touched the space we occupied. That space belonged to memory, to regret, to possibility. "I did not think you would be here alone," he said at last. The words were mild, but they landed with a strange weight. Alone. The word brushed against the part of me that had spent years learning how to stand by myself without collapsing. I lifted my chin a little higher. "I did not think you would notice." His eyes held mine. "I notice more than people realize." It was such a simple thing to say, and yet it unsettled me in a way I could not explain. He had always had that effect, even when I was younger and foolish enough to mistake his attention for certainty. A flicker passed across his face then, brief and unreadable, as if some memory had pressed close and vanished before it could be caught. I saw him glance toward my left hand, where there was no ring, no mark, nothing to explain the life I had built out of absence. My throat tightened. "Are you waiting for someone?" he asked. The question sounded casual, but I knew better. He was not asking about the room. He was asking about the shape of my life. I set the glass down on the nearest table before I could drop it. "No," I said. "I am not waiting." He held my gaze a moment longer, and I wondered whether he heard what I did not say. That I had waited before. That I had waited too long. That waiting had taught me how to survive disappointment, but not how to survive him standing this close without remembering what he had left behind. At last he drew a slow breath and glanced toward the center of the room, where several guests had begun to gather near the stage. "Then perhaps," he said, "you will allow me to keep you company for a while." It was a harmless offer. Polite. Ordinary. Yet it made my pulse jump hard enough to sting. I could have declined. I should have. Instead, I heard myself say, "For a little while." He nodded once, as if accepting terms in a negotiation neither of us had fully named. And when he turned slightly, guiding me with nothing more than the angle of his hand and the steady attention of his eyes, I felt the past move with us, step for step, like it had been waiting all along for this exact moment to begin again. By the time the guests settled into smaller clusters around the stage, the room had taken on that soft, suspended feeling that only appeared in places meant for formal celebrations. Music drifted through the air at a volume low enough to leave room for conversation, and the warm light from the chandeliers turned every polished surface into a quiet shimmer. He moved beside me with the same measured ease as before, neither rushing nor hesitating, as if he had decided that my comfort mattered and intended to prove it by patience alone. It should have felt simple. It did not. Every small courtesy carried the weight of memory, because he was doing now, with effortless attention, what I had once wished for when wishing still felt dangerous. I kept my expression calm, but inside me, one thought would not settle. He was close enough to remind me of everything. Close enough to make me remember how easily a person could become the center of your days without ever realizing the shape they were leaving behind. I asked myself whether he sensed any of it at all, whether the faint pause in his breathing, the slight narrowing of his gaze whenever I looked away, meant that some part of him was uneasy for reasons he could not name. Across the room, a server passed with a tray of drinks, and the bright reflections in the glasses briefly flashed between us like a line drawn and then erased. He guided me toward a quieter edge of the stage area, where the crowd could still be seen, but no one could overhear the details of a private conversation. "Do you come to events like this often?" he asked. His tone was casual, almost idle, but there was something careful beneath it, a note of real curiosity that made the question feel larger than it sounded. I let myself answer with the easiest truth. "Only when I have to." That earned the smallest curve of his mouth, not quite a smile, but enough to soften the sharpness that usually lived in his features. "Then tonight was not your first choice?" "No," I said, meeting his eyes for a second before letting my gaze fall again. "Not my first choice." The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt loaded, like a door left closed only because neither of us had yet decided who would reach for the handle. He glanced toward the stage, where the host was beginning the evening's remarks, then back to me. "You seem very certain of yourself," he said. "Am I?" I asked, and before I could stop myself, a quiet smile touched my lips. It vanished quickly, but I saw the moment it reached him. Something in his face shifted, subtle and brief, like recognition arriving too slowly to be trusted. He did not speak at once. Instead, he studied me with a stillness that made the room around us blur at the edges. It was not suspicion exactly. It was something more unsettling, because it suggested that he was trying to place me and failing in a way that disturbed him. I felt my pulse tighten, but I kept my shoulders relaxed. Years of practice had taught me how to look calm, while every part of me braced for impact. The lights overhead glowed steadily. The music continued, and somewhere behind us someone laughed too loudly at the wrong moment, the sound dissolving almost immediately into the general hum of the evening. He shifted the glass in his hand, then said, "You do not seem like someone who enjoys being overlooked." The words landed softly, but they struck a place in me that had never fully healed. I lifted my chin just enough to show that I had heard him. "No one enjoys that," I said. His gaze held mine a second longer than necessary. Then, as though choosing not to push too far too fast, he turned slightly toward the stage again. I followed the motion with my eyes and noticed how the guests there were beginning to gather into a loose semicircle, all of them waiting for the formal part of the evening to begin. It would have been an easy escape if I wanted one, but I did not move. Something in the steadiness of his presence had made the whole room feel different, as if every sound were part of a pattern I had not yet learned to read. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, gentler. "Stay a little longer," he said. It was not quite a request. It was not quite an order. It was something in between, offered with enough restraint that I could refuse if I wished. And that was perhaps what made it hardest to answer, because he was not demanding anything. He was simply remaining, simply asking, simply making it possible for me to choose. I looked at him, at the line of his shoulder, the calm control in his expression, the way he seemed both familiar and unreachable all at once. Then I said, "All right." The word was small, but once spoken, it seemed to change the air between us. He gave a slight nod, as if he had expected nothing less, and yet still valued the answer. The host's voice rose from the stage, welcoming the crowd into the next part of the evening, but I only half heard it. I was too aware of the man beside me, too aware of the quiet gravity that followed him wherever he stood. He did not touch me beyond the brief guidance of his hand, yet I could feel the impact of his attention like warmth against my skin. And as I stood there beside him, pretending that this was only a polite conversation between two strangers, I could not shake the unsettling certainty that something long buried had begun to stir, and that whatever happened next would not stay ordinary for long. I heard the final notes of the music soften into the background, but I could not have said what song had been playing. My attention was fixed on the man beside me and the strange steadiness of his presence. He offered me his arm with the kind of quiet courtesy that made the gesture feel more meaningful than it should have been, and after a brief hesitation I accepted it. We began to move with the rest of the guests, slipping away from the crowded edge of the room and into a quieter stretch of the gallery where the light was gentler and the voices more distant. The paintings along the wall blurred into color and shape as we passed them, yet he seemed to notice everything, from the arrangement of the flowers to the way the guests gathered in small clusters near the windows. "You look like you would rather be anywhere else," he said at last, his tone mild, almost amused. I let out a small breath that was close to a laugh. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to someone paying attention," he replied. There was no judgment in it, only an easy observation that somehow made my shoulders loosen by a fraction. I glanced up at him, trying to read the expression in his face, but he had already turned his gaze ahead, as if he had said nothing important at all. That only made him more difficult to understand. He carried himself with such calm control that it was hard to tell whether he was guarding himself or simply used to being watched. The longer I stayed beside him, the more I became aware of the little things. The way he paused before answering, as if choosing words with care. The way his attention never seemed scattered, never careless. The way people around us adjusted without realizing it when he entered their space. It was not arrogance, exactly. It was something more contained than that, something deeper and harder to name. We stopped near one of the tall windows, and the view beyond the glass opened onto the city lights below, each one bright against the dark like a thought that refused to fade. He stood beside me in silence for a moment, and I found myself following his gaze out over the street. "Do you come to events like this often?" I asked, mostly to break the quiet. "Often enough to know when they are worth leaving early," he said. "And this one?" I looked around at the polished floor, the elegant crowd, the soft glow of the chandeliers above us. "I am still deciding." "That sounds wise," he said, and there was a faint trace of something warm in his voice now, something that suggested he understood more than he was saying. Before I could answer, a server appeared with 2 glasses of sparkling water, and he took one without looking away from me, as though the interruption had not broken the thread between us at all. He offered the other glass to me, and when our fingers brushed for the briefest second, a small, unmistakable charge passed through me. It was not dramatic. It did not demand attention. It was just enough to make me aware of how close we were standing and how easily that closeness had become natural. I thanked him, but the words felt too small for the strange pulse in my chest. He nodded once, then asked, "Have you been here long?" "Long enough to know when the room starts to feel too full," I said. "And yet you stayed." "So did you." His answer was immediate, soft, and accurate in a way that made me look at him again. He was right, of course. He could have left the moment he wished, and I suspected he had that kind of freedom in every room he entered. Yet he had remained nearby, without explanation, without pressure, as if he had chosen my company for reasons that were entirely his own. The thought made something uneasy flicker beneath my calm. I tried to bury it beneath polite conversation, asking him whether he was connected to the host or simply attending as a guest. He gave me a measured look before answering. A little of both, perhaps. It was not much of an explanation, but somehow it fit him perfectly. There was a distance to him that invited questions while refusing easy answers. There was also, strangely, a patience in the way he let the conversation unfold, as if he had all the time in the world and did not mind waiting for me to catch up. When the next swell of voices rose from the main hall, he turned slightly toward the sound, then back to me. "Would you like to step somewhere quieter?" he asked. The question was simple, but the way he asked it made it feel like a choice I had not known I was waiting for. I glanced toward the crowd, then back to him. "Yes," I said, and the word felt more certain this time. He extended his hand again, not insisting, only offering, and I placed my hand in his. His palm was warm, steady, and unexpectedly reassuring. We moved together down the corridor at the edge of the gallery, away from the noise and the bright center of the room, and with every step I felt the night shifting in some subtle, invisible way. Nothing had been declared, nothing had been promised, but I had the distinct feeling that the evening had already crossed some hidden line, and that whatever waited ahead would not be easy to set aside once it began. I kept my hand in his as we moved down the corridor, and the further we went from the gallery doors, the more the noise softened behind us until it became only a distant murmur. The hallway was lined with framed photographs and tall windows that looked out over the gardens, and the late light from outside laid long silver streaks across the floor. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I could hear the faint rhythm of my own breathing, and I became aware of how unusual it was to feel so seen without being pressed, so guided without being hurried. He stopped near a quiet alcove where 2 chairs sat beneath a painted landscape and released my hand only long enough to open the small door beside it. "This room is usually empty during events," he said, with the same calm voice he had used in the gallery. "You will not be disturbed here." The words should have sounded formal, but they did not. They sounded thoughtful. I stepped inside first and found a space that felt almost hidden from the rest of the building, with a soft lamp on a side table and a wide window that overlooked the darkening trees beyond the estate. The air was cooler here, carrying the faint scent of polished wood and something clean, like rain on stone. He closed the door gently behind us, not with finality, but with the kind of care that made me feel safer than I expected. "Is this better?" he asked. I nodded before I fully trusted my voice. "Yes, much better." He gave a slight nod, as if that answer mattered to him, and moved only a few feet away, giving me space without making it feel like distance. I had met enough people in my life to understand the difference. Some offered a room and then waited for gratitude. Some offered kindness and expected payment in return. But he simply stood there, hands relaxed at his sides, as though he would remain as long as I needed him to and leave when I no longer did. That simple fact unsettled me more than anything else at all evening. I looked toward the window, where the first shadows of evening were gathering over the garden paths, and tried to steady myself. The events of the night still felt strangely unreal. The crowd, the music, the way his gaze had found mine with such precision that it had felt less like chance and more like recognition. I had spent so long learning how to make myself small that being in a quiet room with him, one-on-one, made every thought in my head move too quickly. He noticed my hesitation immediately. "You do not have to speak if you do not want to," he said. "I only thought you might want a few minutes away from the noise." The sincerity in his tone made something in my chest loosen. I let out a breath I had not realized I had been holding and sank into the nearest chair. "I did," I admitted. "I think I needed it more than I knew." He remained standing for another moment, then slowly took the chair across from me, careful and unhurried. There was no pressure in the way he sat, no hunger to dominate the silence. Instead, there was patience, and patience was almost harder to trust than charm. Because charm could be calculated. Patience suggested intention. Outside the window, the sky was deepening into blue, and the garden lamps had started to glow one by one among the hedges. Inside, the room felt suspended, as if time had thinned around us. He rested one elbow lightly on the arm of the chair and looked at me with an expression that was difficult to read, not cold, not soft, but focused in a way that made me feel as though he was paying attention to things most people would miss. "You looked uncomfortable in there," he said quietly. I gave a small, awkward smile. "That is a polite way to say overwhelmed." A faint curve touched his mouth, almost a smile. "Then I will be more direct. You look like you needed an exit." The honesty of that made me laugh under my breath, surprising myself with how easy it came. Maybe I did. He watched me for a beat longer, and I had the odd sense that he was considering something carefully before speaking again. When he did, his voice was softer. "Then I am glad you accepted my hand." The words fell into the room and stayed there, delicate but unmistakable. I looked down at my own lap, aware all at once of how closely I was still holding onto the impression of his touch. It should not have mattered. It should not have stayed with me. Yet it did. More than that, it made me remember the exact shape of his hand, the warmth of his palm, the steady way he had offered support without force. I had known men who used gentleness like a trap. This did not feel like that. This felt like a door I had not realized was open. "I do not usually trust people quickly," I said before I could stop myself. The confession hung between us, plain and unpolished. He did not seem surprised. "That is wise," he replied. "It is also understandable." There was no pity in it, no attempt to soothe me with empty reassurance. Just acceptance. It made my throat tighten more than comfort would have. Somewhere beyond the door, footsteps passed in the corridor and faded again. The estate seemed vast around us, full of rooms and conversations and polished surfaces, but in this small hidden space, it was as if only the two of us remained. I looked up at him again, and this time I did not look away immediately. "Why did you bring me here?" I asked. He held my gaze without hesitation. "Because you needed somewhere quiet," he said. Then, after a pause just long enough to change the weight of the answer, he added, "And because I wanted to know what you would say when no one else was listening." The admission landed softly, but it changed the air all the same. My pulse quickened, not from fear this time, but from the unsettling awareness that his interest in me was not casual. It was deliberate, measured, real. He led me farther into the quiet, away from the corridor, and into a smaller sitting room that had the same restrained elegance as the rest of the estate. The lamps were low. The curtains were half drawn. Everything in the room seemed arranged to encourage breathing instead of performance. I stood near the center of the space with my hands folded in front of me, suddenly aware of how still I had become. He remained near the doorway at first, as if giving me room on purpose, and that restraint said more than any grand gesture could have. It was not the behavior of someone trying to win an argument. It was the behavior of someone trying to make space for a choice. That thought unsettled me almost as much as his earlier words. I had spent so much of my life being told what to expect from people like him, what motives to assign, what distance to maintain. Yet every moment he gave me here made those assumptions harder to hold on to. I turned slowly and studied the room. The books arranged on the shelf, the soft chair by the window, the small table with a glass of water that someone had thoughtfully left behind. It was the kind of room meant for honesty, if anyone was brave enough to use it that way. You said you wanted to know what I would say. I told him at last. My voice sounded quieter here, stripped of the usual strain. He nodded once. Yes. There was no pressure in the word, only attention. I took a slow breath and tried to gather the pieces of myself that still felt scattered from earlier in the day. The conversation before this had stirred up too many old instincts, too much caution, too many memories of being misunderstood before I had even finished speaking. But this was different. Here, with the noise of the house softened around us, I could feel the shape of the present more clearly. Then listen carefully, I said, and I surprised myself with how steady I sounded. He did not move. He did not interrupt. He only looked at me as if I were the only thing in the room worth hearing. The silence stretched, not awkwardly, but with a kind of patient gravity that made my next words matter more. I am not used to being asked what I want, I said. Most of the time, people decide before I have a chance to answer. His expression changed, just slightly. Not pity, not defensiveness, something closer to recognition. That should not have happened, he said. It was a simple sentence, but it carried enough sincerity to make my chest ache. I swallowed and looked away for a brief second, gathering courage from the stillness itself. No, I agreed. It should not have. Outside the windows, the evening had deepened. The estate lights glowed against the glass, and beyond them the grounds disappeared into a wash of shadow and moonlit shapes. I could hear a distant door close somewhere in the house, then silence again. The world continued without urgency, while something inside me had begun to shift too quietly for anyone else to notice. I asked him, "Why are you doing this?" He considered the question before answering, as though he respected it enough not to waste it. "Because I have learned that waiting for someone to speak honestly is harder than speaking first," he said. "And because every time you look like you are about to leave, I realize I would rather understand you than let that happen." The words were not dramatic. They did not need to be. Their honesty made them land with more force than anything polished could have. I felt my shoulders loosen a fraction, even as my thoughts grew more complicated. This was not the kind of attention I could dismiss easily. He was not chasing a reaction. He was paying attention to the parts of me that usually went unnoticed. And somehow that made me feel both safer and more exposed. I walked toward the window, not because I wanted distance, but because I needed something to hold my focus while I thought. My reflection looked pale in the glass, blurred by the faint light behind me. He stood a few steps away, steady and unreadable except for the patience in his posture. "If I tell you the truth," I said, still facing the window, "you cannot act surprised by it later." "I would not," he said. I turned back to him then, and the certainty in my own voice surprised me again. "Then the truth is that I do not know what I am supposed to feel right now." The sentence seemed to settle the room instead of disturbing it. He watched me with the same calm focus, as if I had finally said something he had been expecting all along. "You do not have to decide that tonight," he said. "You only have to be honest." And for the first time in a very long time, honesty did not feel like a demand. It felt like an opening. The room stayed quiet after my words, but it was no longer the kind of quiet that felt empty. It felt measured, like the air itself had stepped back to make space for whatever came next. I kept my eyes on him for only a moment before looking away again, not because I was afraid of his answer, but because I was finally brave enough to wait for it. He did not rush to fill the silence. He simply remained where he was, calm and steady, as if my uncertainty had not made him retreat even 1 inch. That, more than anything, unsettled me. I had expected discomfort, maybe even frustration. Instead, he looked almost relieved, as though honesty had opened a door he had been standing in front of for far too long. "Then we start there," he said quietly. I frowned. "Start where?" "With the truth," he replied. "Not the version people expect, and not the version that is easiest to say. Just the truth as you know it tonight." His voice was not commanding. It was patient, almost careful, and that made it harder to defend myself against. I lowered myself into the chair near the window, folding my hands together to keep them from shaking. The glass beside me held only fragments of our reflections, broken by the darkness outside and the warm light inside, as if the room itself was uncertain how to show us. "I am trying," I said. "I know you are," he answered. "You have been trying for a long time." That simple sentence made something inside me tighten, not because it was cruel, but because it was true. For years, I had moved through every difficult season as if survival alone could pass for peace. I had learned how to stay useful, how to stay composed, how to keep moving even when my thoughts were too heavy to name. But now, sitting in that still room with him watching me like he had all the time in the world, I realized that endurance was not the same thing as healing. I drew in a slow breath and let it out carefully. I keep waiting for the moment when everything feels clear, I admitted. For some sign that tells me what all of this means. For some reason I can trust without having to force it. He leaned one shoulder against the wall, his posture relaxed but his attention unchanged. And if that sign never comes? He asked. I looked down at my hands. Then I suppose I will have to decide anyway. No, he said, not sharply, but with enough certainty to stop me. I looked up. He met my gaze without hesitation. Then you decide what is true for you now, not what will make sense later. The words settled over me in a way I had not expected. They did not solve anything, but they steadied me. For the first time that night, I did not feel like I was standing at the edge of a mistake. I felt like I was standing at the beginning of a choice. Outside, the city lights blurred beyond the glass, soft and distant, while the room behind me remained warm and still. I thought about every door that had closed before this one, every version of myself that had learned to keep quiet, every moment I had mistaken fear for caution. Then I looked at him again and asked the question I had been avoiding all evening. If I say what I really mean, will you still stay? He did not answer immediately, and that made the moment feel honest in a way no quick promise ever could. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, steadier, and somehow more reassuring because of it. Yes, he said. I will stay long enough to hear you. Something in my chest loosened at last. Not fully, not magically, but enough to let the next truth rise to the surface. And when it did, I knew the conversation had finally crossed into the part neither of us could turn away from anymore. The silence after his answer settled over the room like a soft blanket, not heavy anymore, but careful, as if it knew we were standing at the edge of something fragile. I let my hands rest in my lap and watched the light from the city move faintly across the window, turning the glass into a dim reflection of both of us. For the first time in a long time, I did not feel like I needed to fill the quiet to survive it. He remained where he was, close enough that I could feel his presence without being pressed by it, and that mattered more than I expected. It was not just that he had stayed. It was the way he had stayed, without demanding, without interrupting, without trying to fix the feeling before I had even named it. I do not need you to make this easy, he said at last, his tone measured and calm. I just need you to be honest with me. The words should have made me nervous, but instead they brought a strange kind of relief. Honesty had never been the thing I feared most. What I feared was being seen completely and finding out that it changed everything. I drew in a slow breath and looked down at my hands, tracing the edge of my thumb with the other one until the movement steadied me. There were still pieces of the past that felt too sharp to touch directly, memories that had learned how to live under my skin. But something had shifted tonight. He was not asking me to erase them. He was asking me to place them in the open, where they could finally be understood instead of hidden. I have spent so long expecting people to leave when things became difficult, I said quietly. That is why I always chose the safer version of the truth. The smaller one. The one that could not be used against me. My voice wavered only once, and then I found its shape again. But I am tired of living like that. He did not move in to answer right away. He simply listened, and in that listening there was a patience that felt almost unreal. The room seemed to hold its breath with me. Somewhere outside, a car passed, and its headlights swept briefly across the curtain before fading into the dark again. Inside, the warm lamplight made everything feel softer around the edges, as if even the furniture had been given permission to relax. I swallowed, then continued, because stopping now would have meant turning back. What I mean is, I said, forcing myself to meet his eyes, I do not want another careful promise. I want to know whether you are still here when the truth is inconvenient, when it is messy, when it does not fit the version of me I have been trying to present. His expression changed only slightly, but I saw it. The shift was not dramatic. It was better than that. It was real. Something thoughtful moved behind his gaze, something steady and unafraid. Then tell me the messy truth, he said. I am listening. Those 4 words undid something in me. Not all at once. Not in a grand collapse. Just enough to let my shoulders lower and my breath deepen and the old panic loosen its grip. I had expected judgment. I had prepared for disappointment. What I found instead was space. Space to speak. Space to pause. Space to be a person with uneven edges and unfinished answers. I looked at him for a long moment, taking in the quiet strength in his face, the way he held himself like someone who had already decided to stay honest, even if the conversation became uncomfortable. Then I let the next truth come forward, the one that had been waiting behind all the smaller ones. There is something I have not told you yet, I said, and if I say it out loud, it changes how you see me. He did not look away. Try me, he said softly. And because he said it without pressure, without performance, without fear, I finally understood that this was no longer about surviving the conversation. It was about trusting that I could finish it. So I lifted my eyes to his and began. He held my gaze for a long second, and in that silence I could feel the shape of everything I had been afraid to say finally settling into place. The room around us was still, but the air did not feel heavy anymore. It felt honest. I drew in a slow breath and let the words come in the only order they could. The truth is, I said, keeping my voice steady even as my hands trembled in my lap. I did not leave because I stopped caring. I left because I thought caring was the one thing I was no longer allowed to do. His expression changed, not into surprise, but into a kind of careful attention that made it easier to keep going. He did not interrupt. He did not rush me. He simply waited, as if he understood that some stories can only be told when the person telling them feels safe enough to speak slowly. So I did. I told him about the years I spent trying to build a life that looked calm from the outside, while I carried the same old fear underneath everything. I told him about the nights I woke up listening for sounds that would never come, about the mornings I smiled so other people would not ask questions, about the way I learned to measure my own pain in small, private portions so no one else would notice how much it had changed me. As I spoke, his face remained open, patient, and increasingly familiar in a way that made my chest ache. Not because he reminded me of the past, but because he was doing something the past had never done. He was staying. When I finally reached the part one had avoided for so long, my voice caught once, then recovered. There was a child, I said softly, and everything I did after that was shaped by the fact that I wanted that child to grow up without carrying my fear. The words seemed to settle between us like something fragile and precious. He did not look startled. He did not ask the kind of questions people ask when they want a cleaner version of the truth. Instead, he leaned forward just enough for me to know he was with me, completely. You do not have to apologize for protecting someone you love, he said. My eyes stung at that, because it was the simplest sentence in the world and it touched the oldest wound I had. I looked away for a moment, trying to steady myself, and when I looked back he was still there, still calm, still willing to hear the rest. So I gave him the rest. I told him that I had spent years believing I had to carry everything alone. I told him that I had become so practiced at silence that even kindness felt unfamiliar. I told him that when I saw the life I had built begin to soften around the edges, I did not trust it at first, because peace had always felt like something temporary, something that could be taken away the moment I became too hopeful. But now, sitting across from him, I could feel that belief beginning to crack. Not because all the damage was gone, not because the past had been erased, but because there was room now for something else to exist beside it. He let the quiet linger after I finished. Then he said, "Thank you for telling me." That was all. No demand for more proof. No urgency. Just gratitude, offered carefully, like he understood how much courage it had cost me to speak. I felt something inside me loosen at last, something tightly wounded and long neglected. The fear did not disappear, but it no longer ruled the room. I could breathe. I could think. I could be seen without having to vanish into my own apology. He reached for my hand slowly, giving me time to pull away if I wanted to, and when I did not, his fingers settled around mine with a quiet certainty that made my throat tighten all over again. "Whatever happened before," he said, "you are not standing in it alone anymore." I believed him in that moment, not as a promise of perfection, but as a promise of presence. And after everything I had survived, that was enough to change the direction of my heart. For the first time, I did not feel like I was pleading for a future. I felt like I was being invited into one.